Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of November 9th, 2020. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm joined again this week by Josh Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project. Good afternoon, Josh.
Good afternoon to you.
It's been just a few days, really, since our post-election off-schedule podcast last week that we recorded on Thursday afternoon. Not a ton has changed. I guess at the national level, they have called the race for Joe Biden, though I think that was anticipated. The Trump campaign, and to some extent, the Trump administration are resisting that call thus far. And so that remains to be resolved. And I think as that continues, maybe next week, we'll return to the impact of that on the legitimacy of or people's views of the legitimacy of elections, which I've been thinking about a lot. But we might as well see how the next couple of turns of that go and what that looks like. I think today we want to join the discussion on polling a little bit more fully and what went wrong in 2020, which is the most deja vu conversations ever, I think.
I was going to say, what went wrong in 2020? Well, let's start with the polling.
You're right. I think there's a lot of that going around in terms of the number of things people could talk about. I mean, we do want to kind of round up some of the usual suspects. I mean, this is obviously a very active discussion going on right now. From stem to stern.
I just want to throw something out there. I mean, I'm just thinking about this in the moment. I mean, we're being dismissive of it almost as a point of self-deprecation. But I mean, I do think that, there's an important thing that, in terms of focusing on this polling, which is just, in interpreting what happened in the election and our understanding of it and the meaning of it. Ultimately, the best, really the way that we're going to get the most depth of understanding that is going to come from polling, which might sound like a joke right now, but that's kind of part of the problem. And so it is actually not unimportant to really, deal with what was not a very good day for polling.
Yeah, and when we say not a good day, I mean it was not a good day. I mean, early kind of compilations of the state level polling showed the polls being off virtually everywhere and in some key area, some of the key states by quite a bit, 7.5. If you look at the polling averages, generally the Trump margin was underestimated by as much as 7.5 points, and that was pretty uniform. Not uniform, but that was pretty true across the board. A couple of states were reasonably close, but most were pretty far outside of what we would have think. I mean, it's an average. The polling averages are what we're looking at, but if we were to put margins of error on those polling averages, they were outside of what you would say. Well, that was close.
Yeah, and the real problem here is, and this will be the first, glossary term watchword. Here we go. But it's also systemic error, and that's part of the problem here. It's not just that there was error; it's the fact that all of the error went in the same direction. Whether you were looking at all the national polling, whether you were looking at the polls in individual states, in all cases they were underestimating Trump's support, and that's the real problem here.
Yeah, basically, I guess if you look at the 11 competitive states, 10 overpredicted Biden's performance.
Right.
And, that's not really that doesn't say much. And in Texas, it was, the same phenomena and in the same ballpark, right? If you look at the polling averages.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, even before getting to that, you make this, we talk about 10 states, 11 states, and something that, we don't have a lot of time to make in other venues for this, but I'll make it here, which is, and it doesn't really matter what kind of state we're talking about. So if you start thinking, well, was it just, Republican states or just Democratic states, or was it states with early voting, but states without, or it doesn't matter. whole range of possibilities. Doesn't look like the underlying conditions could explain the outcome. So let's just set that aside. In Texas, the averages, the polling average going into the election expected a pretty narrow Trump victory. 538 said that Trump was up on average by 1.1 points. Real Clear Politics, another site that aggregates these, said that he was up by 1.3. It looks like he's going to end up winning by between 5 and 6 points. Now, do you want to let me ask you, Jim, do you want to keep talking about the Texas polling for a minute? Or
yeah, let's do that. People are going to be interested in that.
Okay. I mean, I think one really notable thing about that error is that it got worse as we got closer to the election, which is a strange phenomenon, because generally we tend to think that polls are going to get more accurate as we get closer to the election.
Yeah, we think it's going to be the opposite of what happened.
Right. But if we just look at the average of the polls conducted, just a simple average, if you're a stats geek out there, this is just a simple average of the polls conducted prior to early voting. So in the month of September and the first few days of October before early voting started, Trump was up by 4.3 points on average. So not far off from the 5 to 6 points, certainly within the margin of error of that polling. If you look at the polls conducted during early voting, Trump was up by 1.7% on average, which is kind of striking and also makes no sense. I mean, I'm just going to say that. I think it's, in the sense that if there's one thing we knew about these candidates in this campaign is that, voters were decided. I mean, voters were clearly decided they knew how they felt about both candidates. They certainly knew how they felt about Donald Trump. And, the idea that you had this sort of consistent Trump lead, really, again, in this sort of, let's say, 4 to 8 point range for much of the campaign. And then in the last month, all of a sudden, despite the fact that every other poll up to that point said, 90+% of voters know who they're going to vote for. All the partisans are going to vote for the partisan, basically for their partisan candidate. And yet somehow in that final month, the idea that the polls would tighten by 3-4 points is a little hard to believe. Easy to say in retrospect, obviously, but also it didn't really make sense when it was happening.
Well, I mean, and I think this gets to a little bit to how we discuss these things. But I mean, I think, we'll put a pin in the fact that we're going to talk about, how people put together their likely voter pools. And that seemed to be one of the things we were looking at. It's like, who are these voters that these polls are measuring that are producing such closer outcomes? And we talked about that a little bit at the time, but I mean, one of the things that I'm struck by as I think back on the discussion of this is just, as you say, how much, the specific fundamentals of what was going on, seemed to be telling us that Trump was going to do less well than he did in 2016, which turned out to be the case.
Right. Absolutely.
But we kept looking, I feel like we were missing 3 or 4 points all along. I mean, I think on this podcast 2 or 3 weeks ago, or, I don't know if it was the week before, we were sitting there kind of trying to do the back of the envelope math and saying, okay, so, he's eroded maybe 5 or 6 points among Republicans.
Right.
And he's eroded, there's this sliver of independent voters that have, flipped out. And we never could quite get that to add up, to an erosion of, 7 or 8 points, which is what the polling averages were telling us.
Right. I mean, I should add, when I was saying, going into the election that everybody's opinion, seemed so demonstrably fixed. But I mean, the story of the Trump presidency in Texas to a large extent was the extent to which attitudes towards the president, his behaviors, the administration were incredibly fixed incredibly early. I mean, I remember a poll we conducted in one of the more turbulent periods of the Trump presidency after Charlottesville, I think. Was what happened. There was a lot of, this was at the point at which Charlottesville had happened. That was when Colin Kaepernick started kneeling during the national anthem and sort of the fight with the NFL over that. There were a lot of things going on, and we ended up doing a whole battery of job approval metrics, specific job approval metrics on how Trump was handling these things. And again, it was, I think the list was like 10 or 16 items.
Yeah, it was a
long.
huge battery. Yeah,
and I mean, some of these things were demonstrably going poorly, or were clearly, I would say by just an objective standard, not a great handling of whatever the situation would be. And, attitudes were just so polarized and so solid that, a majority of Republicans, I think, expressed approval and relatively strong approval on pretty much everything we tested. The majority of Democrats, expressed disapproval and in most cases strong disapproval on most of the areas we tested. And this was, I think there was an expectation that the way that Trump was approaching the presidency and really, his sort of jettisoning norms and all these kinds of things would lead to some sort of a backlash. And we never saw it. And that was 2 years ago. I mean, at least. And
there was
it's
very
continued.
little of it. And there was very little evidence of it right up to the eve of the election.
Yeah, nothing changed.
And so, it does, the narrative at the time, and some, in retrospect, and we talked about this, I think, some at the time, that, the narrative was that the Democrats were either going to do one of two things. They were going to benefit from defections away from Trump, of which there was no evidence, or they were going to change the composition of the electorate.
Right.
And as we started looking at the early voting data, I think there was a real tendency to kind of say, okay, well, there's this big group of voters that we don't know anything about.
Right.
Right. And that was those general election only voters, or those voters with no primary records. And I think it turned out that those voters didn't look very different than everyone else.
Well, and I would say, even beyond that, even setting aside what we didn't know, there's also what we did know, which is, even within the huge surge in early voting turnout, and we mentioned Derek Ryan last week, Republican consultant who analyzes, especially early voting in particular, and provides information on it. It wasn't as though Democrats were outpacing Republicans. I mean, when I say Democrats, I mean Democrats who have a consistent history of voting in Democratic primaries, or voters have a consistent, right, versus voters who have a consistent history of voting in Republican primaries. Ultimately, we know those are Democratic and Republican voters, the 90, let's say 98% plus of the time. And it wasn't as though with this surge in turnout, Democrats were rushing ahead of Republicans and, creating a deficit that they would have to make up on election day if the remainder of those voters turned out to be, let's just say, split 50-50. It wasn't even looking that way. And so I do wonder, one of the things I wonder, I don't have an answer for this, is, to the extent that, pollsters were finding increasingly tight races in Texas, or an increasingly tight race in Texas in the final month, I wonder what justification they had for believing that. I don't know. That's an aside. We can come back to that, I suppose.
Well, we may not, that may be an unanswerable question, although it may have something to do with, something we talked about last week, which was, faulty assumptions about what they could expect from Hispanic voters in Texas.
Yeah.
Among other things. There are a lot of candidates, to be fair.
Yeah. And it's funny, with that, we talked about this last week about the extent to which, we consistently find somewhere between 30 and 40% of the Hispanic voting population supporting Republican candidates. And we found that consistently, it was consistent before Trump came to office. It's been consistent since he's come to office. But I think I saw, I think this was from one of the other, big national pollsters released, basically the party ID breakdown or the vote choice breakdown amongst, a large sample of Hispanics of different origins. And so whether the origin country or, is Mexico versus El Salvador versus, Puerto Rico, Cuba. And, what they found is not surprising, Cuban Americans were the most Republican group amongst Hispanics. And, it was funny. I was looking at it and amongst, say people with Mexican ancestry, of which that's the majority of Texas Hispanics, it was the same numbers. It was about 70-30 Democratic lead. And that's nationally, that's not Texas. And so it's like, I don't know why this was such a surprise to people that Biden wasn't doing better, or wasn't doing, again, I would say beyond reasonable expectations with Hispanics, because it was beyond reasonable. And I wonder to what extent, again, this influenced people's reading of the polls. If the assumption was, again, this thing that, again, there's been no evidence for, that if we just keep putting more Hispanics in the electorate, eventually that Hispanic group is going to become more Democratic. Well, I don't know if that's true.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of discussion of that. I don't know if you saw it. I was gonna send it to you, and I don't know if I remember that. Our colleague David Leal has a co-authored piece in the Monkey Cage blog in the Washington Post that talks about some of these issues and expectations getting ahead of reality. And I think it's been a cliche of talking about the Latino, the quote unquote Latino electorate for as long as there's been one, really, or one conceived as such. If you had a dime for every time somebody said Latinos are not a monolithic group on either Fox or MSNBC, you could retire yesterday.
But
I think that's really coming home to roost now in terms of, honestly thinking, and, this has been a very controversial thing in kind of Latino studies and the academic study of Hispanics, at some point it is fair to wonder where the conceptual groundwork or the conceptual integrity of Latinos as a group identity comes from, right? And what utility it serves, other than as, some kind of gross geographic / linguistic generalization. And I'm just, we could talk about that a bit, but I mean, I think it is an underappreciated piece of this. I mean, because if you had said, hey, we need to look at the Mexican American vote, the Cuban American vote, and the Puerto Rican American vote, taking, the three biggest nationalities, setting aside Central America again as a region, which in itself would break you into would require you to break out Salvadorans and Nicaraguans. And you see where I'm going. I mean, on one hand, that makes a lot more sense, and you're less likely to have this confusion over, well, wait a minute, what about the, Miami Hispanics versus the, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that has not been fully confronted, in part because of, the way that we've settled on the fact that we talk about Hispanics and Latinos as a racialized group. And one of the problems that we've talked about, that you've mentioned on here before, is that, the implicit comparison, which is sometimes, very misleading with African Americans.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you even leave out of that, the additional layered complexity of, generational status, right? So are you a first generation American? Is this second generation? I mean, and that adds another layer across the races and ethnicities in terms of, incorporation to society. So it's just, anyway, we could probably just talk about this for a while. Maybe we're kind of dancing around, I guess, what we think the potential challenges were here, although we're
I think that's right. And so so let's talk about the quickly again the narratives that are out there. So the return this week has been the return of the shy Trump voter.
Right. Did you see the shy Trump voters driving down Main Street in their caravan?
I did,
waving their flags too high. Yeah, they're real shy.
Yeah.
No. Well, exactly.
Now So we can lay out, the shy Trump voter theory is, basically, at least in one form, that people responding to polls that support Donald Trump feel social pressure to not admit that they favor him, that they would vote for him.
Right. And this, I should say, is something is a theory I feel like comes much more from pundits than from actual pollsters. I don't really hear pollsters making this theory because, to be honest, there's almost no evidence for it. And in fact, this was a consideration in 2016. Pollsters went back, looked at their data. They've been doing a lot of stuff in the meantime, experimentally, to figure out, is this plausible? Is this likely to be the case? And as the simplest, kind of quickest example of why it's probably not is it doesn't matter whether you ask people whether they, who they support with a live interviewer, someone on the other end of the phone who's a human being who presumably is the person that you would be being shy in front of, or whether you answer the question online or via text message or to a robot. If it was the case that, Trump voters were shy about expressing their preferences, then you'd expect to see greater support for Trump in polls where the respondent's not actually talking to an actual person, but we don't see that. I mean, there's some other problems with this that are, more complicated, but we don't see this. And I think, and the other piece of this is, I got to say, I almost despise this argument. Despise is a strong word. But part of it to me is the extent to which pundits who don't really conduct polls are talking about what it sounds like is a group of people expressing a preference that they can't imagine people would express, even though 70 million people express that preference. Like, it's not as though, there aren't Trump voters in a lot of places.
And your joke earlier about the shy Trump voters kind of speaks to, why on one hand it might seem, even less likely this time, given that we're not seeing a lot of evidence of shyness among many Trump voters, given boat parades and caravans and MAGA merchandising but it's fair to say that those the media coverage of those events, those folks may not be representative of your average Trump voter, just to be fair.
Right.
As we think about this, and we were just talking as we came on about the New York Times Nate Cohen's piece on kind of explaining, his first cut at this, which he ends by saying, as we all are, we're going to have to wait and see, as he's kicking around the ideas. But, the idea that there might be something that's different, that could overlap the existence of shy Trump voters, the idea of non-response bias, that, that Biden supporters are more likely to respond to polls and Trump voters are less likely to respond to polls. I think it was in the Nate Cohen piece, the suggestion that the anti-institutional bias of some section of Trump voters, and particularly the anti-media bias, is so strong that they would not want to respond to pollsters. Maybe. Sure. Maybe. I'd like to test that more, or figure, it would be interesting, to see, trying to think if we had any items that we could really test that on.
People have done this in some other ways. I mean, one of the things, again, we won't get too complex here, but ultimately we call this non-response bias, and it's something that's common in polls. And there are some groups of people who are just more likely to respond to polls than other people. And we saw this in 2016 in the sense that, the big alleged problem of 2016 was the overrepresentation of college-educated voters.
Right.
Well, college-educated people are just more inclined to sit on the phone with a pollster or with the call center rather for, a certain amount of time talking about what they think about stuff. And that's just part of life. It's something that we deal with. And so, this idea of non-response bias was something that was being kicked around in the professional community. I think, even I recall, last time I looked, it was at least, 6-7 months ago, as we were coming to the election, people were thinking about this.
It's come up.
And what they did was, because a lot of polls will ask at the end of the poll who you voted for in 2016. And number one, there wasn't like a huge evidence of, shyness there about reporting who you voted for. But one of the things you could do is you could weight the results of your survey back to the demographics of the 2016 electorate and the vote share. And in doing that, in most polls that looked, and most pollsters who looked into this, it didn't change their results. That was the thing. It barely moved it at all and really had no consistent direction. So it's the preliminary evidence on that front is also relatively weak, but we'll see.
That will get looked at more. But the most common, or not the most common, the most plausible thing, as you and I have been talking about, it does go back to something that we've talked about here before, but is kind of, in a way, we talked about it a few weeks ago, mostly in the realm of carping, I would say, in terms of talking about people not disclosing their likely voter models and the art, the science, and, I think to the point when we talked about it, the mystery of people's likely voter models. Turns out that's going to loom pretty important here in terms of people estimating what the actual population was. And we've kind of talked about it on here before, on the podcast before, but it's becoming apparent that all the uncertainty in the electorate in terms of the increase in turnout, who is going to vote,
pandemic,
just the size of the electorate, writ large, really underlines the idea that we really got to think a little bit more about how we're defining likely voters and how we're communicating that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm not allowed to carp. Is that right?
No. You can carp a little.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think the basic premise here is that every estimate of an electoral outcome has some underlying electorate basically assumed in that estimate. Now, again, pollsters may be more or less explicit about how much they want to guess at the electorate, but ultimately it's a guess, right? And this is the key thing here, is that normally, I've been saying for, at least the last week or so, it's frustrating because, election polling is just a subset of all surveys. And in most cases, when we conduct surveys, we know a lot about the population we're surveying. In fact, we know, usually we usually have very good information about the populations we're surveying. So if you ask me,
and we know more and more all the time now, given the use of databases and
exactly,
quote unquote.
Right. And so, but I mean, in the simplest sense, if someone tells, a pollster to go conduct a poll of adults in Texas, we can go to the most recent census data and the most recent census estimates to tell us what share of the adult population should be male between the ages of 18 and 30 with a college degree. We can know that. We actually have really good data about that kind of stuff. We have no data besides prior elections and what people tell us when it comes to deciding what the actual electorate is going to look like. And so ultimately it forces pollsters to come up with, again, there's a likely voter model that says, okay, well, how are we going to include people in this electorate? But then underlying that, again, is a composition of the electorate. And I think, that makes a big difference. I mean, and I was joking with you last week, but I mean, I feel like when I started in this role, people would ask us all the time, they'd say, well, what, we'd put out an election estimate. People would say, well, what share of your likely voter sample is Hispanic? And it was often Democrats would ask, but the assumption being that we didn't have enough Hispanics in the likely voter sample was kind of what the underlying, this was, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And you'd go and you'd say, oh, it's this or it's that. And we'd say, hey.
7 or 8 months ago.
Yeah, it's true. But then the thing is, I feel like those questions have kind of stopped. I mean, and I don't know whether it's the volume of polling that took place. I mean, certainly in Texas, there was an increased volume of polling, but it felt like there was a volume of polling everywhere. And to a large extent, and I'm not blaming the media for this, but the reporting of it was just say, here's the estimate. It's by this by this person, this group, this institution. It's of likely voters in Texas. And that was about the extent of the information. And the thing that I think we're always curious about, and we're always looking into when we see these new results is, well, one, how did you define a likely voter? And two, what's the composition of this electorate then that's producing this result? And in a lot of cases, that information was not available. I would say in most cases, actually, that information was not made available to anybody. And I think, you combine, I think the difficulty of handicapping what an electorate would look like in Texas that adds, 2 to 3 million voters, depending on whether you're comparing it to 2016 or 2018. Again, the likelihood of a pandemic and an economic crisis pulling more voters into the polls because of the fact that politics all of a sudden becomes more pertinent and more salient to people if it's affecting their livelihoods. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And I think, the polling, I'm going to say the entirety of the polling enterprise, from pollsters to aggregators to the media and the way that they reported it, really glossed over all the uncertainty inherent in that and just started saying, well, Biden's up 8.
Yeah.
We have a 90% probability of winning.
Yeah. And not to be too, I don't know if this is abstract or not to be too whatever about it, but I mean, I think the bottom line is that, you were kind of laying this out is that, we're actually estimating a population. We're taking a sample from an estimated population that actually does not exist at the time that we're polling.
Right.
because people are, because we're estimating what the electorate is going to look like after the fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean,
and that is
difficult.
That is not captured. That is not captured in the standard margin of error measure.
No, and the standard margin of error measure in and of itself is actually
sampling error.
That's only sampling error. So when you hear, the margin of error in a poll, what you're talking about sampling error. The real overall error with, what they call with design effects, which account for non-response bias and the weighting, is usually about twice that. So just from the beginning of this, we are, as a collective, whatever group of people putting this information out, but we are basically decreasing the amount of uncertainty that we say that we have by about half. Which, again, uncertainty is part of the enterprise. It's a sample. And again, as you point out, and this is the key thing, it's an estimate of the preferences of a population that doesn't exist.
Which, when you say it that way, it's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy.
I mean, it's also like why, we often go, election polling over. Let's get back. Thank goodness the session is coming and we can talk about policy where we know what the population we're estimating is stable. It exists.
Well, and in that, the interesting thing about that kind of work is it's really more about asking the right kinds of questions. Where in election polling, the question is fixed, more or less. I mean, there's some ways in which it might not be, but the question is fixed. It's this candidate, that candidate, and whoever else is on the ballot. But the real nub of how accurate your estimate is going to come down to getting the mix of groups in the electorate close to right.
But even that question, there were some polls that didn't do trial ballots. That got, in other words, they asked, would you vote for the Republican Donald Trump, the Democrat Joe Biden, or someone else? Now,
so many problems with that.
Yeah, and there's huge problems. And clearly there were people doing that. We won't name any names, but if you go back to our polling blog and you follow some links, you'll see people that did that.
Yeah.
And it's problematic, right? So that's just, that's just a thing that occurred to me that, we could, if we were to really take those things apart. So, I mean, as we think about this, watch for an op-ed that Josh and I think will probably be circulating later in the week, unless they don't like it. And it's just a very, short opening gambit at this, but I we'll talk about this more and we'll have some more stuff at the website going forward. But, two things here. One, disclosure and more transparency. That is, there's been a discussion that's been going on for 15 or 20 years now about better norms of disclosure, better standards of practice in terms of how poll results are reported out by the people doing the polls and the entities that are reporting them and, for the last decade or so, aggregating them, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. In other words, the the Real Clear Politics and the 538s of the world. We've really got to revisit that in terms of the issues we've been talking about today. And there's got to be an intermediate piece of that is about better explanation and better contextualization. And I think that, one of the things that's happened as an unhappy result of the presence of poll aggregators and, sections of the New York Times and the Washington Post and, the major media outlets that say, hey, this is our kind of data science, data journalism section where, basically, and this is the key part, if you're interested, you can learn a lot more about this. Mm-hmm. That has not stopped the beat reporters and the daily kind of horse race coverage from simply reporting the numbers and moving on without any context. And something about that has got to change that I think acknowledges the fact that, look, people are going to complain about this. Polling is not going to go away because it's what you got. And it's too deeply ingrained. So it's got to be how we do it that has got to get better. And it's got to be reporting. Some of it is reporting on our end, but a lot of it is also going to be how it's propagated.
Yeah, ultimately, something that I've been saying throughout this cycle is that, these are just estimates. These are not, perfect representations. These are the best attempts of, I think usually, straight shooters who are trying to do the best work they can, because it's really, look, this isn't a point. There's no, the idea that there's this question of is this just liberal pollsters? Well, look, there's two things I kind of point out against that. Number one, there's no point in doing a bad job professionally to advance your career. That doesn't really work. And so a bunch of people doing a bad job for some kind of, perceived abstract good, let alone the fact that I don't believe that, poll results being out really changes behavior much in an election, and especially in this election. But ultimately, pollsters don't get more work by doing bad estimates. So I just don't really buy that. But the other thing is that people are talking about sort of the liberal media bias or the liberal bias and wanting to see these kinds of election results. But the truth is, it wasn't as though the campaign pollsters were doing a ton better. Some were, but if you look, for example, at the final days of the campaign for both Trump and Biden, Trump campaigned in Iowa on the Sunday before the election, even though he won the state by 8 points. And Biden campaigned in Ohio on Monday before going on to lose that state by 8 points. If their data was so much better and so much, less problematic than the data that was publicly available, I don't see why.
Presumably they'd have made different decisions. Yeah.
Presumably. So just to set that aside.
Right. So I think we're going to wind it up there. We will, thanks to Josh, thanks to the folks in the Liberal Arts Development Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you for listening. Thanks to all the people that voted, even though they made the polling much more difficult, at least in part. And we will be back next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.